But now that we get to chapter 11, this is something special, and I've kind of been waiting to get to this chapter just because it's so exciting to look at this one. And in fact, I don't know if you know this or not, but you in this church are one of the first people to read this chapter in its context in light of what's going on here in history. I'll say that again. You in this church right now are among some of the first people that are going to hear this chapter in its context according to what's going on in our world today. And this is awesome. You know why you're the only people? Number one, most people don't teach the book of Revelation. A lot of churches don't even get to this. For many of you, you've never even been through this book because no church has really gone through it. So we're one of the few that is going through it, but we're also some of the few that get to go through this book in light of prophetic events that are happening in our world right now, today. And this is unbelievable. I've been studying the Bible for many years. I've been studying the book of Revelation for almost as long. It was one of the first books that I was really passionate about learning among all the rest of the books, but this one really caught my eye. And every time I study this book and I go through this chapter, it's like we've gone another light year ahead of where we were before. By the end of this morning, I hope you'll understand. But you ever heard a child in the back seat of a car utter this phrase, "Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? How much longer? How much longer? How much longer?" About 20 years ago, I remember for the first time driving next to somebody on the freeway and just happening to glance over and see a TV screen and little kids in the back seat watching TV. I remember thinking to myself, that is the greatest invention in the history of the world. And nowadays, they put TVs in cars, but it was kind of a short-lived thing because everybody's got a cell phone now. And my daughter, when she was 2 years old, man, before she could even talk, she could operate my iPhone. I don't know how you could do it, but she could pick it up, she could hit the buttons, and she loved to make all my little apps shake, right? Which meant that she was erasing things. Nowadays, though, we go on a road trip, and the first question out of my daughter's mouth, to which I usually answer no before she asks it, is, "Dad, can I have your phone?" We can't even go to 7-Eleven down the street without her wanting to play on my phone. But you see, I grew up, and many of you grew up in a different time. Before there were iPhones or iPads, computers, or TV screens on the back seats, you had a car. And that was it. Right? And if you grew up in a house like mine, which in my house, we had bought, now I'm a kid from the 80s, and my dad, I remember when we bought it, was a brand new, 1984 Honda Civic. Prior to that, we had the station wagon. Remember the station wagon that had what we used to call the Wayback, you know? And parents would barrel down the freeway with 15 kids playing on the football field in the back seat of that car, you know, without seatbelts or anything, and we lived. My parents got an 84 Honda Civic. It was a small, compact car, got good gas mileage, and in those days it was a wonderful car. When we went on road trips, though, my dad was a minimalist. All right, my dad was a minimalist. He didn't like taking a whole bunch of junk. And so you got one toy. You got to choose one toy. And I had two sisters. There was a family of 5 inside this Honda Civic. And we used to drive down to my grandparents' in Roseburg, Oregon. We lived up in western Washington. We drove down to Roseburg, Oregon. It was about a 5.5-hour drive on Interstate 5 down there. So for 5 hours straight, where there was 3 young kids in the back seat with one toy apiece. You know how long that one toy lasted? Not long. And my dad, not only was he a minimalist, he also hated stopping because he loved to tell people how fast he could get places. Right? Because he would get there and he'd be like, we made like no stops in 28 hours straight. You know, poured gasoline from my 7-Eleven cup into the car as we're going. No big deal. You know, I made it there in like four minutes. You know, he was always going on about how long. And so we hardly ever stopped. So it was long distance, never stopping, one toy. And me and my sisters, we were always getting into mischief, and you know the questions always came out. And my dad, after the 50th time, of course, would do the dad thing. If you ask that question one more time, I'm going to pull over and paddle your butt. You know, and be like, you know, and we'd hear that, and we'd be like, oh my goodness, you know, and you knew Dad was going to follow up on it, you know, but at the same time, you wanted to stop too. So, you know, if one of them got in trouble, you know, you knew you could at least get out of the car when Dad's, you know, taking care of the other sister. I feel like people, though, look at the Lord's coming kind of similar to that. For those who have been touched by Jesus and you've been hearing about the Lord's return, it feels like, well, everybody feels like it's been close. In fact, even John and the Apostle Paul wrote in times where they said, the Lord's coming is soon, and yet here we go. We've been here for 2,000 years, and soon, evidently, means 2,000 years. So when pastors today talk about the Lord's imminent coming, we look at that, and sometimes people write it off and say, yeah, I've heard that. You know, in 2012, some guy bought a whole bunch of billboards up around the United States and said that it was going to happen on that date. And he set a date, and people sold their houses and went out and, you know, stood out in a field. For many times, certain denominations, certain religions actually, have called and said that the Lord's return is going to happen on this day. I don't know how they can know that, because even God himself said no man knows the day or the hour, but for some reason these men say, I know, and they set this date, and then it doesn't happen, and many are disappointed. But we keep hearing about the Lord's coming. So the question I think we can ask ourselves today is, are we there yet? Are we there yet? And I studied this passage, and I'm so excited to share with you where we're at today. In fact, I've got some information that shows us that we are super close. And I don't say that lightly. I'm not just a fanatic. I'm not just a fringe guy that says, yeah, Jesus is coming soon. No, he really is coming soon. And today you're going to see just how close we actually are. So if your Bible's open to Revelation chapter 11, we're going to read verses 1 and 2 here. John says, Then I was given a reed like a measuring rod, and the angel stood, saying, Rise and measure the temple of God, the altar, and those who worship there. But leave out the court which is outside the temple, and do not measure it, for it has been given to the Gentiles, and they will tread the holy city underfoot for 42 months. So John now, once again, just as in chapter 10, and chapter 10, remember, was the chapter where we kind of said, why is this here? The angel shows up, he comes down, some think it's Jesus, I don't think it is, and he utters something. He's declaring that the Lord's day is happening, it's coming now. We've made it all the way through 6 trumpet judgments, we're waiting for the 7th. The angel utters something, the thunders, respond, the 7 thunders, but John's told not to write down what the thunder said, and so we're sort of left, like, what happened? What'd they say? And then he goes up and he eats the book from the angel's hand, and so we're fresh off the heels of that. We're sort of still in this parenthetical sort of like off to the side of the stage chapters or section after chapter 9. And so now as we get into chapter 11, John, after eating the book, is once again called to be an active participant. Remember, in the beginning, he was just called to be the secretary. Hey, all I need you to do is write the things which you see, the things which were, the things which are, and the things which will take place after these things, metatauta, after the church age, okay? And so he says, write these things down. You're the secretary. I want you to write these things down so you can share them with other people. And John says, okay. He's writing it down, but now he's called to be a participant. Now he says he's given a reed, okay? And what this means, literally, we might, in our modern day equivalent, say yardstick. He's given like a yardstick, or what we would actually use better than that is a tape measure. He's given a tape measure. John, go and measure 3 things. 1, measure the temple. 2, measure the altar. And 3, measure the people who worship there. Now we'll get to the 3rd one in just a second, but the first one is significant. He says, measure the temple. Go out and measure it. Now why would he be called to measure this thing? And by the way, we're not even given the measurements. So what the measurements are is at this point insignificant to us. It doesn't matter. What the emphasis is on is that he was told to measure it. Now, why would he be told to measure it? Well, in these days, much like even today, when you measure out a piece of property, you are sort of declaring ownership over it. You're measuring it up. If I bought a piece of property, in fact, when we were doing the work here in the church, the county, we had to have it surveyed. You have to bring a surveyor, and that's what they basically do. They measure out the property, and they put the boundaries, and they show where things are, and they give an idea on both the size and what's on the property and the value of it and stuff like that. And they say you have to have it surveyed. Well, when you buy a piece of property, you do the same thing. You're owning it. I want to know what I have here. So he's told, measure the temple, measure the altar, make sure that it meets the dimensions of what God has already laid out in Deuteronomy, which it does, I'm sure. But then he says, measure the people there. And to me, this is kind of funny. In my mind, I see like Gomer Pyle coming back and say, well, the average height is 5'10". That didn't happen. That's just me inserting myself in the story. But he says, measure the people there. Now, why would he measure the people? Well, this also gives us insight into God. He's not measuring them by height, but rather seeing if they measure up. Does their worship measure up? You see, that's an interesting little insight right there, because God pays attention to how we worship. Did you know that? Our worship, or lack thereof, is noticed and measured by God. He sees it. And it's not, by the way, who's singing the loudest or the hardest or the most beautiful, because God actually sees the heart of worship. Is your heart worshiping the Lord? If it's not, he sees that. And so he says, measure the people there. Now, I want to say something right here, because this is where we depart from those who want to replace the Israel with the church. Like, it's called replacement theology. In other words, God doesn't like the Jews anymore because they rejected Jesus. They're cast aside. The church is now Israel, and they see the book of Revelation. And anytime you see the temple, since Paul said, hey, the body, you are the temple of God. The church is the temple of God. And so, when they say that, what they're saying is here, this is the church. He's being told to measure the church, and the church is the people. Well, the church is already gone. We've already kind of pointed that out. At the end of chapter 3, the church is never mentioned again. Okay, it's not even brought up. And remarkably, everything from that point gets Jewish. Okay, every time you have to understand something, you have to go back into the Old Testament scriptures to see where the equivalent is to find out what exactly is being talked about. And so when he says here, the church, it can't be the church, because he says, measure the temple of God and the altar. Well, what's the altar then? If that's the church, then what's the altar? And who are those who worship there? Why would you do that? And then he says specifically what not to measure, verse 2, but leave out the outer court, which is outside the temple, and do not measure it, for it's been given to the Gentiles. So that's why it can't be the church. This is not spiritualized to the point of misunderstanding. This is, believe it or not, I don't know if you follow me on this, but when he says go measure the temple, I believe he's talking about a temple. And when he says measure the altar, yeah, it's an altar. And the people who worship there are the people who worship there. And the outer court, which he's not supposed to measure, he's not supposed to measure. So if this is talking about a temple, it fits in remarkably with what Jesus and Daniel and the Apostle Paul all talked about. And it's very significant as to our timing of events and how close we are right now to this event that we're reading about taking place. First of all, let's go back to Matthew chapter 24, and let's see what Jesus has to say about there being an actual temple. The book of Matthew, or the Gospel of Matthew, it's the first book in the New Testament. If you hit Zechariah, you went too far, back up one book. Matthew chapter 24. Jesus has been asked, what are the signs going to be of your coming in the last days? Because he just said, they didn't ask that specifically, but when they were walking past the temple, they were showing Jesus the temple, sort of like a Jewish tour guide, and Jesus, check out that temple. And he says, yeah, don't get too attached to it, because, hey, there will a day coming where there won't be one stone left upon another. And they thought that meant the end of the world. So they asked him, basically, when is the end of the world going to happen? And so he goes on. There will be wars and rumors of wars. There was deception is going to be in the last days. This is the first mention of fake news, by the way. Don't you know if you know that? Truly, it says deception is going to be constant in the last days. Nation will rise against nation. They'll deliver you up and kill you. And then he gets to this interesting part right here in verse 15 where he says, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, that's an event, spoken of by Daniel the prophet. Okay, Jesus is referring back to Daniel. And he says, standing in the holy place. Now, there's only one place that's referred to as the holy place, and that is the temple. Okay, there's the holy land is Israel. The holy city is referred to, that's always Jerusalem. And then he says, the holy place. Well, there's one place inside the temple that was holier than other places. It was called the Holy of Holies. It was the inner room in the temple that only the priest could go into. That's where the presence of God, and the priest could only go in there once a year. The high priest could only go in there once a year. And it was such a dangerous job, they used to tie a rope to his waist and hang a bell on his clothes, so that if the bell ever stopped ringing and they thought he was dead because he didn't go through the ritual cleansing rite, they would pull him out by the rope, because anybody who went in to get him would die. So that's how serious the Holy of Holies was. And that, by the way, when Jesus died, when it says the veil was torn, the veil was what separated the world and the Jews from that holy place. When Jesus died, that veil was torn, because when everybody's been made righteous, you now have access to the throne room of God. You now have direct access to God. You don't have to go through a priest or anybody else. You go through Jesus, and therefore you have God. But he says something specific. In the last days, there's an event called the Abomination of Desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet. And who's he standing in the holy place? Well, we have to go back to Daniel to find that out. So would you please go back a few more books to Daniel chapter 9. Let's look at Daniel chapter 9. Keep following. We're driving towards something here that's pretty special. Daniel chapter 9. Daniel is talking about the 70 weeks. We call it the 70 weeks of Daniel. This is the time of tribulation. Verse 25 of Daniel chapter 9 says, Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall even in troublesome times. This is a prophecy that was fulfilled, but what he said is, from the order given by Artaxerxes to rebuild the temple, from that moment on, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. That'll be 69 weeks total. Okay? And from that point on, that's when the Messiah will come. Well, if you do a little simple math here, you use the right calendar, the Hebrew calendar, which is used for prophetic, which is a lunar calendar based upon a 360-day year. It's important to know that. You will go from that order that Artaxerxes gave in 445 BC and fast forward 483 years, and you arrive to, guess what day? You arrived to around 32 AD, and you arrived to the day that Jesus rode into Jerusalem on a donkey, the day that Jesus was cut off, the day that they didn't receive him as their Messiah. This is important. Then he says, after 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off. Oh, gosh, that's remarkably accurate. But not for himself. No, of course not. He was cut off for us. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. That is a prophecy that was fulfilled. 70 AD, the Roman general Titus destroyed the temple of God. This is when Jesus said, not a stone will be left upon another. The reason for that was because after they surrounded the temple, which was the last long holdout of the Jews were inside and they were holding out against the Romans. The Romans didn't want to destroy the temple because it was so valuable and there was so much gold in there. One of the soldiers he got drunk and he accidentally lit the temple on fire. And what happened was, as the temple burned, the gold melted and it went between the stones of the temple. And so the soldiers, in order to get the gold out, they took the entire temple apart, stone by stone. Jesus said, not one stone will be left upon another, and he was right. So if that prophecy is correct, and the people of the prince who is to come is the Antichrist, are the Romans, that tells us that the Antichrist to come is probably going to rise up out of Europe, somewhere around where the old Roman Empire was. He said, the end of it shall be like a flood, and to the end of the war, desolations are determined. Then, okay, now we can fast forward. That 70th week of Daniel is the tribulation period. That's what we've been talking about. He says, then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. In other words, 7 years. But in the middle of the week, he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering, and on the wing of abominations shall be one who makes desolate. That's the event Jesus was referring to. In the middle of the week, 3.5 years in, 42 months, 1,260 days, the Antichrist is going to rise up, and he's going to put an end to sacrifice and offering in the temple. How does he do that? Well, he makes the temple unclean. How does he do that? I'm glad you asked. Paul tells us. Now turn forward to the book of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. We're going to look at what Paul has to say about this. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, Paul begins, Now, brethren, concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our gathering together to him, we ask you not to soon be shaken in mind or troubled, either by spirit or by word or by letter, as if from us, as though the day of Christ had already come. Let no one deceive you by any means, for that day, in other words, the day of the Lord, that day will not come unless the falling away comes first. That falling away literally is translated taking away. This is the rapture event that we talked about many weeks ago. That day will not come until the rapture event happens, it says, and the man of sin is revealed. That is the Antichrist, the son of perdition, who, listen, opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. That's a description of the abomination of desolation. It's literally the abomination that makes desolate. Okay, and what that means is the Antichrist is going to, according to Daniel chapter 9, he's going to sign a covenant with the nation of Israel and all the nations surrounding to allow the Jews to rebuild their third temple. Then, halfway through that tribulation period, 3.5 years in, he's going to go into the temple and declare himself God, and that will make an abomination before the Lord. That will stop sacrifice and offering in the temple. And that's going to bring with it, Jesus says, when you see that event happens, start running. Get out. Don't even go back to get a coat. Don't even go back to get your wallet or your cell phone. Leave it. Get out of here. It's going to get really bad. God's wrath and the things that we've been hearing about are going to be poured out in force after that moment. So the Jews are going to receive this Antichrist, it would seem, as their Messiah. Remarkably, if you study Islam, if you study Shia eschatology, which is the return of their what they call a Mahdi, when you read the Shia description of the Mahdi that they're awaiting for, their savior, or their 12th Imam, as they also call it, he remarkably sounds exactly like the biblical description of the Antichrist. So the Jews will receive their Antichrist to rebuild their temple. The Muslims are going to get their Mahdi back, and they're going to see him as the savior of the world. There will be a one world religion, which we're going to read about here soon. And halfway through that tribulation period, though, the Antichrist is going to stand in the temple and declare himself God. Whoa. That's incredible. That's what the scriptures tell us exactly what's going to happen. Paul also says in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 that the man of sin cannot be revealed until we're taken out of the way. That which restrains, he says, must be taken out of the way, and then he can be revealed. So the Holy Spirit and the church are removed from the earth. We saw that in chapter 3. That's the order of events. Okay, so the question we can ask ourselves, and this is the bombshell question today, how close are we to rebuilding this temple? Well, I can tell you that for years, there's two major issues to rebuilding the temple of God right up on the Temple Mount. One of them is the Jews don't care. They didn't care. 1948, they became a nation. 1967, they fought a war of annihilation. 1973, the Yom Kippur War, they were almost annihilated again. They fought many wars since then, but most of the Jewish nation is secular. A lot of them are atheists. And it's always shocking when we go to Israel, when we have a tour guide that he's taking you to biblical places, you're reading the Bible, and you're seeing all the places where Jesus stood, and then you find out your tour guide is an atheist and doesn't even care about God. And you're like, what? How do you not? How do you read Isaiah chapter 53, man? You're blind. And the scriptures would say exactly that. Yes, the Jews are blinded in part until Jesus comes back during that tribulation period. And this is all part of God's plan. But most of the people in Israel, they don't care about rebuilding the temple. In fact, in 1996, though, there was a poll done, and they found out that 18% of Jews were in favor of rebuilding the third temple. Well, that left 80% that was not in favor. However, it seems as though God is doing something and stirring the hearts of his people, because that same poll was conducted again in 2013, and they found that 30% of Jews were now in favor of rebuilding the temple. And probably 40 to 50% of them were undecided. Only about another 25 to 30% were against it. That's interesting, 2013. However, in 2017, that same poll was conducted once again. Now 68% of Jews are in favor of building the temple. That's incredible. God is working in the hearts of his people, is he not? That's exciting, but I got two videos I want to show you.
Shalom and welcome to today's virtual Israel tour. Over the last 2 weeks, we've been talking about some of the amazing outcomes of the 1967 Six-Day War. Today, we want to show you a prophetic shift that occurred when the Temple Mount came back into Jewish hands, opening the door to the building of the third Jewish temple. Some called it a kiss from heaven.
On June 7, 1967, Israeli Brigade Commander Mothe Gur made an announcement the Jews had waited to hear for some 2,000 years. Retaking this ground was important for a number of reasons. For one, it's where King Solomon built the first Jewish temple. After the Babylonians destroyed it, Zerubbabel laid the foundation stone for a second temple that was later expanded by King Herod. It fell at the hands of the Romans in 70 A.D. When Commander Gur declared that the Temple Mount was back in Jewish hands, it rekindled hope for a long-awaited third temple.
The Six-Day War was a miracle of biblical proportions and was a cataclysmic opening of a new era for Israel and for the whole world.
Rabbi Chaim Richman of the Temple Institute is dedicated to rebuilding the Jewish temple. He sees the time since the Six-Day War as a prophetic shift.
It would be hard, I think, not to see what's happened in the past 50 years as a tremendous jumpstart, a tremendous fast forward. It's more than prophetic. It's like a kiss from heaven, you know, it's like a divine kiss. It's an intimate brush with the reality of God's compassion and love, and He keeps His promises.
The Institute shares a key connection to the battle for Jerusalem. Its founder, Rabbi Yisrael Ariel, served with the 55th Paratrooper Brigade that captured the Temple Mount. After the victory, a Jordanian guide gave them a remarkable tour.
His job was to carry the company machine gun. There's a very beautiful photograph of that. He actually, the first night of the liberation of Jerusalem, he was given the task of guarding over the spot of the Dome of the Rock, which of course we believe is the Holy of Holies. The story, though, that he told us is that the soldiers were on the Temple Mount, and it was just like the first hour or so. And they were approached by a Jordanian fellow in Western dress who explained that he was the official tour guide for the Jordanian parliament, and he offered to take the soldiers and show them the sights on the Temple Mount. And he takes the soldiers, you know, the rabbi there, and he says, well, this is exactly where the sanctuary stood. This is where the altar stood, and then this is where the menorah stood. It tells him all these things about the history of the Holy Temple. Finally, the rabbi asked him, why are you telling us all this? And he said, well, we have a tradition from our fathers, they from their fathers, that one day the Jews would wage a war and conquer this mountain and rebuild the Holy Temple. And I assume that you're starting tomorrow. And I want this to be my part in helping you.
What was their reaction to that story?
Well, gosh, I guess they were pretty surprised, but the bottom line is, in hindsight, it doesn't look like we were ready.
50 years later, that's changed, with the Temple Institute preparing blueprints and gathering official temple elements, such as the priestly garments. Richman is also dispelling myths about the temple on today's digital loudspeaker, YouTube.
Let's start at the beginning. What was the Holy Temple really all about?
All of this means talk of rebuilding the temple is no longer considered a fringe idea.
Today, there is a lobby in the Knesset of how many members of Knesset that are constantly speaking about Jewish rights to pray on the Temple Mount. There are members of Knesset that actually talk about the rebuilding of the Holy Temple. Do you understand that 20 years ago, these people wouldn't have been given a moment on prime time television in Israel to say these things? They would have been laughed out.
So, a few years ago, this was considered fringe?
Zealots, lunatics, peculiar. Today it's mainstream.
One of those members is Yehuda Glick.
10 years ago, there was not a single member of Knesset who ascended Temple Mount. Today, we have 20 of the Knesset members who are interested in ascending Temple Mount, praying on the Temple Mount, and are part in the battle for the redemption of the Temple Mount and for bringing the Temple Mount back into the center of the next step in the redemption process.
Richman sees the temple through the eyes of the prophet Isaiah, who wrote 3,000 years ago that God's house would be a house of prayer for all nations.
It means basically that there's a God in the world and that the best is yet to come, and that we are so connected to Him and to each other and to that purpose and to all humanity. And it's just a wonderful privilege to be here with you today, to be looking out over Jerusalem and to realize that we're living in probably the most important time in history. If you believe in the God of Israel and you see His hand on His people and you understand the tremendous changes that have gone on over the years, you see that the one who brought us this far isn't finished and will keep His promises.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, the Temple Mount, Jerusalem.
If you'd like to know more about the Six-Day War, this pivotal and many say prophetic time in Israel's history, CBN Documentaries produced a docudrama called In Our Hands, The Battle for Jerusalem. If you'd like a copy for yourself, your home group, or your church, you can go to cbn.com/inourhands. Tomorrow, the Ark of the Covenant that traveled with the children of Israel through the desert on their journey to the Promised Land. We'll take a look at where some believe the missing Ark might be.
hardline religious group Mate Irgunei Hamikdash, or headquarters of the temple organizations, has a mission to rebuild a Jewish house of worship on Jerusalem's Temple Mount. Currently home to Al-Aqsa Mosque, Islam's third holiest site, the location has been long contested between the two religions. The Jewish group, however, maintains that the location is key for fulfilling biblical prophecies.
It is a new start of the redemption, and we hope that next year or even before we will be on the Temple Mount. The law will come from here. All the 70 nations, they will have a seat in the court, and the law will be the law of the Bible.
On a rainy day before Passover, the organization gathers on a rooftop in the Old City to carry out a controversial practice: ritual sacrifice. Under the watch of high security, the sheep is brought to a secluded area. Religious followers continue to make final preparations.
We're on another milestone in the process of the return of the Jewish people to their homeland.
Young men playing the role of priests dress in biblical-looking clothes. It's now time to begin. Everyone gathers to pray as the priests reenact ancient traditions from the Bible.
The event that takes place here is not an event in itself. It's a practice. It's a training. And people are coming here to learn, to understand.
Out of the eye of the public, the sheep is slaughtered. Its blood is brought out for ritual use.
And maybe this year, in 4 days later, the representative of the groups of the Israelites will come with their lamb to the yards of their temple. We built a kosher altar and start all the ritual of Pesach lambs.
To complete the sacrifice, the lamb is skinned and displayed for the group. The body is cooked to be eaten later that night.
Wow. Do you realize that 70 years ago, Jerusalem didn't even belong to the Jews? 70 years ago, Jerusalem was a city and it existed, but Israel didn't exist. They were still under what was known as the British Mandate, and the British, is a thumb in the eye to the Jews, named it Palestine. The Palestine, that name comes from the ancient Philistines, which were a constant enemy of the Jews. The general from the Britain Command knew that, named it Palestine as sort of a thumb in the eye to the Jews. And by the way, when you hear the term Palestinian, those who live in the area of the West Bank and stuff, there's no such thing as a Palestinian. These are people of Palestine, and those are Philistines. Those people who live there now are Arabs. They just simply use that term to anger the Jews because they were their ancient enemy. 70 years ago, though, 1948, God fulfilled his prophecy and his promise to bring the Jews back in Ezekiel chapter 37. It's called the dry bones prophecy. When we go to Israel today, whenever we land and everybody is completely shot because we've been flying and traveling for 24 hours, the first thing I do, as soon as we get on the tour bus and we're looking at the road signs that say Jerusalem this way, Beersheba that way, we get up there, we open our Bibles, and I read Ezekiel chapter 37. It says, I'm going to bring my people back into the land. And when we do that, we look out the windows and say, this is the fulfillment of that prophecy we're riding in the bus in Israel today. Okay, but that prophecy was fulfilled. They didn't even own Jerusalem until 1967. They didn't own all of Jerusalem. Jordan had control of the eastern Jerusalem. They had control of western Jerusalem, and there was a wall, a border that went right down the middle of the city. And Jordanian snipers used to hide. In fact, today, if you go there, you can go to one of the buildings where the parliament was for the Israel, and there's still bullet holes on the outside of the wall because Jordanian snipers used to sit on the Jordan side and shoot at the Jews over the fence for no particular reason at all, other than they just hated them. So in 1967, the Jews were facing a war of annihilation. Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, elements of Saudi Arabia and other Arab countries all formed a coalition to what they described as to push the Jewish pigs back into the Mediterranean. They wanted to kill every last man, woman, and child in the nation of Israel. They were terrified. They thought that they were all going to die, so they built these graveyards. They built caskets right in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, and they thought that they were going to suffer a massive slaughter, except for the fact they have a big, big, big God who decided that, instead of letting all my people die, I'm just going to go ahead and win this war in 6 days. And they did. It's called the Six-Day War, 1967. Jerusalem was reunified at the very beginning of that first scene that I showed you. The military called out, the Temple Mount is in our hands. If you go to Israel with us today, I'll take you to the old city of Jerusalem, and I have a friend that owns a shop there where you can buy paintings. His dad was with that military unit. He grew up in Jerusalem. He called his wife in Tel Aviv and said, "Bring the kids. We just got a house here in the old city of Jerusalem." He lives there today. He's a really cool guy. Anyway, back to the story. So they get the Temple Mount. That scene takes place with a Jordanian guard, and did you hear that? Within Islam, within the Arabs, there's a tradition, weird, that the Jews were going to win back the Temple Mount in battle and that they're going to rebuild their temple. Even the Nation of Islam believes that. Isn't that crazy? That's going to happen. That's the tradition. And so he gave them a tour to show them. Now, how would the Muslims know where the Holy of Holies was? How would they know where the menorah stood? How would they know where all these things are? Well, because there's a major issue to the Jews building a temple right now, and you saw it in that video. It's called the Dome of the Rock. The Dome of the Rock, you see that big golden dome that sits up on top of the Temple Mount. That is a Muslim heritage site. It's the third holiest site in Islam. Muslims must travel there at least once in their life, and they go there and they pray to Allah. That is supposedly the site where Muhammad, the founder of Islam, ascended up into heaven. Gosh, where did they get that idea? This was built in around 600 AD, 600 years after Jesus. And he built, when the Muslims took back that area, the city of Jerusalem, from the Byzantine Empire, it was mostly a Christian city in those days. They took it back and they tore down all the churches and they built mosques over the foundation of where the churches used to stand. And one of the places they built was the Dome of the Rock. So why can't the Jews just simply rebuild their temple right now? Well, because if they were to flatten the Dome of the Rock to rebuild a temple there, how do you think that the Muslims would handle that? They would have generations of jihadists coming, and they'd have to deal with that all the time. And so most of the Jews, they don't want a war. They don't want to fight anymore. They just want to live in peace. And so they said, you know what? Let's just not even mess with the Temple Mount. Let's just leave it sitting there. And for years, no one cared, except for in the last 20 years, the opinion and the attitude began to change. Did you see the guy with the red hair and the beard? He is a member of the Israeli Knesset, which is the equivalent of our Senate or congressman. And what he said was, 20 years ago, they wouldn't have even been given a vote. They were considered right-wing extremists, conspiracy theorists, they might say today. Now, there are many members of Knesset that are asking to pray on the Temple Mount, which, by the way, the Jews control, but they don't own. Rather, they own it, but they don't control it. It's a weird thing. They own it, they have the security around it, but they've given it over as a condition of peace to Jordan. So when you go to the Temple Mount today, if they allow you up on that particular day, you go up there and you'll notice that the guys holding machine guns are Jordanian army guys. They are the ones that tell you what you can and can't do. So if they catch you praying up there to anybody but Allah, you can be arrested. Okay, and be taken out, and it's not good. It's a nightmare. I had a friend leading a tour there, and one of the ladies thought that I'm not going to listen to them. So she got down and she prayed to Jesus, and boom, she got snatched up immediately, and it was a nightmare for the tour. But that's the reality today, but that's going to change. The only thing standing in the way of the Jews rebuilding their temple is, one, the Antichrist is going to sign a peace deal. I don't know if you've been watching the news lately, but the Jews have now just simply signed a peace agreement with Bahrain, with the United Arab Emirates, and several other Arab nations right now that are on the cusp of signing peace agreements with Israel. And this is, guys, this is incredible, all right? This would be the equivalent of California turning Democrat or turning Republican. Okay, these countries want to have nothing to do with Israel. What changed? Why do all of a sudden these nations want to have something to do with Israel? Glad you asked. There's a very good answer for that. Oil. For years and years and years, there was a proverb in Israel that God led Moses around the desert for 40 years just to bring him to the only place in the Middle East that doesn't have oil. Everybody else seemed to have it except Israel, until lately. They were drilling out in the Mediterranean, and they found massive natural gas deposits. This was huge for Israel because they didn't have any of their own natural resources to make power, their electricity. So they had to buy power from their neighbors, who, by the way, hated them. They had to buy coal from their neighbors, who, by the way, hated them, or pay a lot more money to have it shipped in from people who were willing to do business with them. And so they had to make money to buy their stuff just for the power, and that was sucking down their economy. What happened when they found natural gas? Well, it's pretty cool. Last time I was in Israel, we were staying in a hotel right on the Mediterranean Sea, and just to the right, there was a long conveyor belt, went about a mile out into the sea. And I asked, what was that? He said, that's where the ships used to unload the coal. That's a power plant over there to the right. I said, well, the last time I was here, there was smoke coming out of the smokestacks. What changed? He goes, we don't use coal anymore for anything. He goes, the entire country has been converted to natural gas. We are going to be energy independent for the next 1,000 years. And he says, and beyond that, we have so much natural gas, we're actually selling it now to our neighbors, and we're building a pipeline to go across the Mediterranean so that we can begin to sell to Eastern European nations. Not only that, but they've also laying a power line across the Mediterranean so that they can sell electricity, because now they're exporting electricity. Now they're exporting gas. That's going to make them very wealthy and rich, and they're going to be selling it to their Eastern European neighbors. Not only that, but in the Golan Heights, they were drilling. Zion Oil actually got down and found oil in the Golan Heights. Then not only that, they also found that underneath all that natural gas, and they're keeping this very, very quiet, is an ocean of oil. They have now discovered the resources that, if properly used, in which they are looking at doing, they will be the richest place in the world. They have the resources now to be the richest place in the world. They're going to greater than the United Arab Emirates. Gosh, I wonder why the United Arab Emirates just signed a peace agreement with Israel. And you know, it's shifting the attitude towards Israel right now, because the Palestinians, so-called, in the West Bank, who have Hamas as their terrorist organization, who randomly fire missiles into areas of Israel. In fact, the last time we were in Israel, our tour guide, his family lives within what they call the missile zone. And missiles were being fired into Israel, and his wife was spending the night in their bomb shelter in their home. And he went out and led the tour for us the next day. It was incredible. I was just like, dude, don't you need to go home? He's like, nah, she's fine. It happens all the time. Like, they live in a world where rockets just fall in their neighborhood, all right? And so these things happen. They're going out, but the problem is they're beginning to lose their support from their Muslim neighbors, because now they're signing peace agreements with them. And so the Palestinians are losing their support. You know what's happening in Israel? Peace. Also, what's shifting is the attitude toward rebuilding the temple. So the only thing that has to change is getting rid of that pesky little Dome of the Rock. In 1991, when we were waging a war in Iraq, Saddam Hussein began to randomly fire Scud missiles right into Israel, and he was trying to draw Israel into the fight so he could garner support of more Arab nations. And Israel held their peace. They didn't do it. And these Scud missiles were like Hitler's V-2 rockets. They were sort of unguided. They would just go up, and they would land, and they would blow up somewhere in Israel. And everybody was terrified, except for a section of Jews that are known as Orthodox Jews. And every time the alarm would go off in the city of Jerusalem, they would run outside, look up in the air, and pray that God would guide one of the Scud missiles right on the Dome of the Rock. It's hilarious, isn't it? I know we've gone a little bit long, but I think you'll appreciate why. There's one event left to happen that I believe is going to not only usher in the Antichrist, but it will also take care of the Dome of the Rock and will allow the Jews to rebuild the temple. It's called the War of Ezekiel 38. Remember, I told you the prophecy of Ezekiel 37 was that God would bring the Jews back into the land. Now, I'd love to go through it with you and read it with you, but it's kind of long, and I've already gone to a little bit over time. So what I want to do is sort of just give you an overview of what's going to happen. Ezekiel chapter 38 tells us that Russia and Turkey and Iran are going to form a coalition, and God, he says, will put hooks in the jaws of Gog of Magog. That is, Magog is Russia. Meshech and Tubal are cities that you can find today. One is now called Moscow, and the next one is called Tobolsk. They're the ancient cities of Meshech and Tubal. Gog, the leader, right now would be Vladimir Putin, is going to form an alliance with the leader of Iran and the leader of Turkey. And the hooks in the jaws, I believe, is going to be oil and gas. I believe that 20 years ago, and now they found it, and now it's going to happen. And in case you haven't been watching the news, for the first time in the history of the world, Russia, Turkey, and Iran have formed an alliance. All three of them have their militaries right now in Syria. All three of them have their militaries in Syria, and that happens to be on the border of Israel, which also happens to be the Golan Heights that's separating them where the oil is. Israel signed a peace agreement with Russia right now. And I don't know if you know your history or not, but back before World War II, there was a couple of countries that signed a peace agreement with Hitler. Neville Chamberlain in Europe, in England, he signed a peace agreement, which obviously was broken. And so did Joseph Stalin. He signed a peace agreement with Hitler. Hitler broke both of those. He was a front runner, I believe, of the Antichrist. He broke those agreements and invaded and caused war with them. Right now, Israel has a peace agreement with Russia, but I believe right now they're making their plans to invade and to take all of that oil and gas. Remember when I said that Israel was building a pipeline to Eastern Europe to supply them with both gas and electricity? That pipeline is almost completed. Guess who supplies the Eastern Europe with gas and electricity? Russia. Guess who doesn't like competition? Russia. Guess who supplies all of Israel's neighbors and those who hate them with military arms and AK-47s? Russia. They have a peace agreement right now with Russia, but guarantee you that agreement is going to be broken. They're going to invade, but God says, so that the nations of the world will know that I am God. He says he is going to destroy all three of them with an earthquake, with hailstones, and blood mingled with fire. Where have we read that before? Isn't that interesting? That one thing is yet to happen. And I believe, this is my guess, I don't know exactly how it's going to play out, but I believe either the earthquake or God himself will destroy everything up on the Temple Mount and pave the way for the Jews to rebuild that temple, which now the Jews want, which now there are members of Knesset demanding for. And do you think that the people in Israel who right now are atheists or agnostic would all of a sudden believe in God when there's an army of Turkey, Iran, and Russia on their doorstep ready to kill them all? I believe there's going to be a little revival take place in Israel at that moment. And I believe that without firing a shot, as the scripture says, God is going to burn all three of those nations. He's going to take out hundreds of thousands of their soldiers, and Israel is not even going to fire a shot. And he is going to win. He's going to show the nations and the world and Israel, I am God. And you know what the Jews are going to do? They're going to rise up. They're going to be praising God. They've already got the priests established because the Temple Institute has already been training them. They've already got the vestments. They've already got everything done. They already know how to sacrifice the lamb. They've already got the plans for the temple and the financing for it. As soon as that Dome of the Rock is gone, as soon as the people are excited and they want God, they're going to demand to build their temple. But before that happens, a trumpet's going to sound and we're going to disappear and the Antichrist is going to rise. So while the world is focused on coronavirus, right now, the events have been set in motion for these things to take place. So if we're seeing the temple getting ready to be rebuilt, and if they're going through practice runs in Israel right now and they've already got the priests, I didn't even talk about the red heifer. You want to know about the red heifer? Come back next Sunday. We'll talk about that next Sunday. Okay, let's do that next Sunday. Y'all, there's so much more we could have gotten into today. There really is. There's so much more that we could have gotten into. That is just one of the markers, and we only made it 2 verses into chapter 11, which I was prepared to teach through the entire thing. But we do have a second service, so next week we're going to pick up in verse 3, and we're going to look at the other sign that is just as cool as that one, and we're going to go round and round, and we're going to see just how close we are to the Lord's return. But let's wrap it up here. Heavenly Father, I thank you, Lord, for